Welcome back to Harvard. We're going to go to the belly of the beast right now. Democratic pollster Stan Greenberg and his partner James the Raging Cajun Carville put out a report today about a Republican focus group they held in the wake of Joe Wilson screaming, "You lie," at President Obama during that joint session. Here's part of their conclusion, which may surprise you. Quote, and you can argue with this, we're going to do it. Quote, "We gave those groups of older white Republican base voters in Georgia a full opportunity to bring race into their discussion, but it did not ever become a central element, and indeed was almost beside the point." So if race is beside the point, then what is the point? David Corns, the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones, and Ron Brownstein is the political director for Atlantic Media. Gentlemen, before we go further than that bottom line, that race is not a factor in this right-wing thinking, let me show you something from a poll, a research poll done by the Daily Coast this summer. It talks about those who believe in this birther thing out there. It was back in July, and they sponsored this poll. The highest regional percentage of people who believe that Obama wasn't born in the country was down in the South. Only 23% say he was born in America. 47%, only 47% say he was born in the United States. The rest either don't know or thought he was born somewhere else. Up north, the more liberal Northeast, which is attacked by the right, 93% say he was born in the United States. So the birther question has radically different answers depending where you ask it in the country. Ron Brownstein, you do a lot of number crunching. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that? Is that, in fact, a counterpoint to the argument that there's not a race element to the right?
Well, there's obviously a racial element to our politics. About 90% of John McCain's vote came from whites. Part of the reasons why the South would be more inclined to believe the birther argument is it's the most Republican region of the country today. We've lived through a realignment of Southern whites from being the most Democratic to the most Republican portion of the electorate. Where I agree, and so I think it is wrong to say that there is no element of racial resistance to Obama. Certainly, you look at the vote in places like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and you would say that. But I agree with Stan Greenberg, who really is as sharp as they come in American politics, that the principal engine of the reaction we are seeing to Obama is not race. It's part of it. There's kind of a sense of cultural alienation from the new America that he represents, the multicultural America that he represents. But the principal force that we're seeing here is an ideological recoil from the conservative Republican base on the broad sweep of his agenda.
So Lyndon Johnson was wrong, you're saying, Ron, back when he said when he signed the Civil Rights Bill, he wrote off the South for decades to come. He was wrong, you're saying.
No, that was the initial impetus, but we've moved way past that, Chris. I mean, certainly in the 60s and 70s, the initial wave of realignment of white Southerners from the Democratic to the Republican Party was overwhelmingly driven by race. But now it is the attachment to the Republican Party goes way beyond that. You're talking about cultural values, evangelical Christians, overwhelmingly Republican, especially in the South, views on national security, views on the role of government. Race is no longer, I believe, the principal reason why conservative Southerners identify with the Republican Party. If you had to pick one reason, I would say it is religious values and cultural values rooted in evangelical Christianity far more than race.
I'm going to keep arguing this because I'm not sure. David Corn, I want to ask you this question. Why is it that all the liberals we know, every liberal we know was thrilled that this country was capable of electing an African-American president, and you did not hear that thrill exciting the body or the soul of conservatives? They were not thrilled by the idea this country was capable of getting beyond its race past. It's racial past, not racist, but racial past. Why is it that liberals liked that idea and conservatives didn't like it, or were not thrilled by it?
Well,
they just didn't have the same reaction.
Well, you could say because, in fact, they liked Barack Obama, and if it had been Michael Steele getting elected president, God forbid, there might have been a different reaction. I think the race question.
So? You think so? I disagree with you.
Well, I think to a part. I do think, though, that conservatives have, and it's hard to divide up the factors here, that there is a racist component to the anti-Obama opposition and to Republican or conservative resistance to many
David,
social
you're wrong. Let me tell you, David, if Colin Powell were the Republican nominee for president, any one of the last cycles, a hell of a lot of Democrats, would have voted for him. Yeah, a hell of a lot. And they would have been thrilled if he beat their candidate.
Let me back up your point.
That's how they're different.
Chris, give me a moment to back up your point here for a second. Because I listened to Stan Greenberg today and James Carville when they released the report and heard what they said about race not being a factor. But it's interesting to me that one of the key criticisms coming from these Tea Party people or the conservatives they talk to is that Barack Obama, or key suspicions, they still believe he wasn't born in the United States and that he's a secret Muslim and that he's actually advancing a secret agenda to destroy the United States. This sounds hyperbolic, but that's what these people say. And now, is it just a coincidence that he happens to be black or not? Or are people finding other ways of opposing him, other ways of fearing him or thinking about him, because they know now that just an explicit racial reaction is not acceptable in polite company?
Chris, I think, first of all, I think Obama, to many people, to many conservatives and to many of these kind of culturally conservative voters, symbolizes a new America, a changing America, whose face is literally changing. This was the first election, as we've often said, in American history where more than a quarter of the vote was non-white. And I think Stan and James are right that there is an alienation bordering on separatism in big portions of the conservative electorate that is exerting a tremendous centrifugal pull on Republican elected officials to oppose Obama. The only thing I would differ with in their report is I think they understate the degree to which there is also skepticism about the expansion of government among the independent portion of the electorate that, without having these conspiracy fears, share some of these concerns. You know, Gallup polling last month, 57% of Americans say the government is trying to do too much. That's the same level that we had in October of 1994, and it's over 60% of independents agree with that sentiment. So while the conservative Republican base is the most agitated, they are not alone in having this kind of reaction that maybe perhaps we're going too far too fast. Obama does have to deal with that. He's never going to mollify the conservatives, but he does have to find a way to reassure those independents who have been moving Democratic, especially those upper middle class, college educated voters.
Do either of you guys believe that you can get an honest answer on race from anybody in America? For example, take a group, and this is a tricky subject, but take the jury that basically acquitted O.J. Simpson. Everybody thought it was important who was on that jury. Jury selection was very important. The fact there were a lot of African Americans on that jury was considered important, and the fact there weren't many on the later civil trial was considered important. If you had polled that jury like a focus group, do you honestly believe, Ron Brownstein, that the jurors would have said that they voted along racial lines, or they would have said, no, I voted because we thought the police blew this case, they were dishonest in the way they handled the evidence? What would they have said? Would they have said it was racial, or would they have said it was the evidence?
I agree with you that I've said it was racial. On the other hand, Chris, Obama's approval rating among white voters at this point in his presidency is probably higher than Bill Clinton's was at the same point in his presidency. And the fact is that his share of the vote among whites was really within the band that Democrats have experienced for the last 30 years. I mean, you know, the share of the Democratic vote among non-college whites is only varied between 38 and 44%. He got 40. So I have a hard time seeing race. And sure, there are voters who will not be for him because it's black, but many of those are the same voters who would not be for almost any Democrat. And the principal problem he faces now, I believe, is not a racial reaction as it is an ideological backlash that is primarily that is most fierce in the Republican base, but does extend beyond that to some independents that Democrats have been winning.
I think people have been able to find other reasons to oppose him, even if they, at some part of their consciousness or subconsciousness, they have a racial reaction and they see his race as being symbolic to losing America. You look at these Tea Party rallies, there's a lot of signs, I want my country back. You know, they really believe that there's been something of an invasion. But they have so many other reasons now to put forward that I think it's hard to get an honest answer, as you just said, how much race is a part of it. And to some degree, though, it doesn't matter. If this is the reaction they're having, whatever the reason is, and if they're believing that he's a secret Muslim and he has a secret plot to destroy America, does it matter if it's because they're crazy or they're racist or they're just, you know, listening to too much Glenn Beck?
I agree with David that there is a cultural element to this alienation among conservatives, but it goes beyond that. That's one piece of the puzzle. I don't know if it's race-specific, as Obama represents a new America in which they don't see themselves fitting in.
Yeah.
We could do an hour on this. We could do 10 hours on this. And by the way, the only time this conversation is going to be over is when the young people who are 25 years old right now wonder what we're talking about 20 years from now.